In the vast darkness of space, where civilizations rise and fall like distant stars, there exists a universal truth that every sentient species learns. Fear is the great equalizer. It courses through the veins of the mighty Zephyrian Empire, whispers in the minds of the ancient Kalari Collective, and even touches the cold hearts of the mechanical Nexus Syndicate. But what happens when you encounter a species that has weaponized their fear? What happens when you stand beside warriors who have turned their deepest terror into their greatest strength? I am Commander Thexan of the Galactic Defense Corps, veteran of 17 campaigns across 4 spiral arms. I have faced the void spawn of Kepler, 442, survived the crystal mazes of Andromeda's Prime, and led charges against the hive minds of the Outer Rim. In my 3 centuries of life, I believed I understood courage, honor, and the price of victory. I was wrong. It wasn't until I found myself standing shoulder to shoulder with human warriors, watching them prepare for what could only be described as a suicide mission, that I truly understood what it means to be afraid. Not afraid of death, not afraid of pain, but afraid of the terrible beauty of what sapient beings can become when they refuse to surrender. This is the story of how humanity taught an entire galaxy that sometimes the most terrifying thing in the universe isn't a monster lurking in the dark. Sometimes it's the light that refuses to be extinguished, no matter how impossible the odds. Sometimes it's hope itself. The first time Commander Thexan laid eyes on a human warrior, he was standing in the observation deck of the GDC flagship Eternal Vigilance, watching what appeared to be a massacre unfold on the surface of Kepler, 438b. The planet below was a churning mass of red dust and crystalline formations, home to one of the most hostile environments the Galactic Defense Corps had ever encountered. The indigenous Scorth had been systematically eliminating every exploration team sent to establish a mining colony there. Thexan's mandibles clicked nervously as he observed the latest attempt through the ship's enhanced sensors. 12 figures in primitive-looking armor were making their way across the jagged terrain, moving with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural. They weren't running from the Scorth hunting parties that had been tracking them for the past 6 hours. They were walking toward them. "Commander, the human team has reached Waypoint 7, reported Lieutenant Vexura, her crystalline skin reflecting the light from the tactical displays. Scorth forces are converging on their position from 3 directions. Should we prepare for extraction?" Thexan studied the tactical readout with growing confusion. According to their intelligence, the Scorth were apex predators on their home world, standing 3 meters tall, with natural armor plating and claws capable of shredding through standard military-grade protection. They hunted in packs of 20 or more, used sophisticated ambush tactics, and had never lost a territorial dispute with any off-world force. Yet these humans, these relatively small bipedal mammals from a world the galactic community had only recently made contact with, were approaching the largest Scorth concentration the Corps had ever recorded, and they were doing it on foot. "Negative on extraction," Thexan finally replied, his voice carrying the authority of 3 centuries of military service. "But maintain full tactical support. I want to see what they're capable of." He had heard the reports, of course. Humanity had been discovered just 18 months ago when one of their crude chemical propulsion vessels had stumbled into the edge of Zephyrian space. The initial contact had been peaceful, if awkward. The humans seemed friendly enough, eager to learn about galactic civilization, quick to adapt to new technologies and diplomatic protocols. But there had been whispers, stories from the Outer Rim about human merchant vessels fighting off pirate raids with nothing but improvised weapons and sheer audacity. Tales of human explorers walking away from crashes that should have killed them, then hiking for weeks through hostile terrain to reach safety. Rumors that the human military was asking for the most dangerous assignments available. Thexan had dismissed most of it as typical new species mythology. Every race had their legendary warriors and impossible survival stories. The galaxy was full of species who thought they were tougher than they actually were. Now, watching the tactical display, he was beginning to think the rumors might not be myths after all. The first Scorth hunting party struck from the north, 23 individuals moving in perfect synchronization through the rocky outcroppings. Thexan expected to see the humans scatter, fall back to a defensive position, maybe call for orbital support. Instead, they did something completely unexpected. They charged, not a panicked rush or desperate last stand, but a coordinated assault that split their 12-person unit into 4 groups of 3, each group targeting a different section of the Scorth formation. The humans moved like liquid mercury, flowing around obstacles and covering each other with a precision that spoke of countless hours of training and absolute trust in their teammates. The engagement lasted exactly 47 seconds. When the dust settled, 23 Scorth lay dead in the red sand, and the humans were already regrouping and moving toward their next objective. None of them appeared to be seriously injured. How was that possible? Lieutenant Vexera whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's environmental systems. Fexen didn't answer immediately. He was too busy studying the recordings, trying to understand what he had just witnessed. The humans hadn't used any advanced technology, no energy weapons or force shields or tactical enhancement systems. They had fought with kinetic projectile weapons and some kind of explosive devices, technology that most galactic civilizations had abandoned centuries ago as crude and inefficient. But the way they used those primitive tools was anything but crude. Every movement had purpose, every shot was precisely placed, every tactical decision was executed with machine-like efficiency. They fought like they had been born for it, like warfare was as natural to them as breathing. More importantly, they fought without fear. The second Scorth hunting party attacked from the west 43 minutes later. This time, 31 Scorth had organized into a more sophisticated formation, using the terrain to their advantage and approaching from multiple angles simultaneously. Fexen found himself leaning forward, his claws gripping the edge of the observation platform as he watched the tactical display. The humans saw them coming from nearly a kilometer away. Instead of taking cover or calling for support, the human squad leader, a female the others called Captain Rodriguez, gathered her team into a tight circle. Fexen watched in fascination as they appeared to be having a casual conversation, occasionally pointing at different features of the surrounding landscape. Then, without any apparent signal or dramatic preparation, they simply walked apart and disappeared into the rocky terrain. For the next 27 minutes, Fexen watched what could only be described as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. The humans didn't fight the Scorth. They hunted them, using nothing more sophisticated than camouflage fabric and an intimate understanding of their environment. The human team systematically eliminated the entire Scorth hunting party. They moved through the battlefield like ghosts, appearing just long enough to neutralize a target before melting back into the landscape. The Scorth, despite their superior numbers, natural armor, and intimate knowledge of their own territory, never managed to mount an effective counterattack. By the time it was over, 31 more Scorth were dead, and the humans were once again regrouping as if nothing significant had happened. "Commander," Vexera said, her voice tight with something that might have been fear, "the third hunting party is approaching from the south. 47 individuals, including 3 pack leaders." Fexen nodded absently, his mind racing as he tried to process what he was observing. The Scorth pack leaders were legendary for their tactical intelligence and combat effectiveness. A single pack leader was considered equivalent to an entire GDC Marine squad in terms of threat assessment. 3 pack leaders working together had never been defeated by anything less than orbital bombardment. He opened a communication channel to the human team. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Commander Fexen aboard the Eternal Vigilance. You have significant hostile forces approaching your position. Recommend immediate extraction to orbit." The response came back almost instantly, and Fexen was surprised to hear what sounded like amusement in the human captain's voice. "Negative, Commander. We appreciate the heads up, but we've got this handled. Just make sure you're recording everything. This is going to be educational." Educational. Fexen's mandibles clicked in what his species considered a nervous laugh. He had been a military commander for longer than most species had recorded history. He had seen every form of combat the galaxy had to offer, from the ritualistic dueling traditions of the Valerian principalities to the hive mind swarm tactics of the Andromedas collectives. He thought he understood what education looked like in a military context. He was wrong about that, too. The third engagement began differently. Instead of waiting for the Scorth to attack, the humans took the initiative. Captain Rodriguez led her team in a direct assault on the Scorth position, moving across open ground with no apparent regard for cover or concealment. To Fexen's trained eye, it looked like suicide. The Scorth pack leaders apparently agreed. They positioned their forces in a classic ambush formation, allowing the humans to walk directly into what should have been a killing field. 47 Scorth warriors, led by 3 of the most dangerous predators on the planet, against 12 humans with primitive weapons and no backup. The battle lasted 93 seconds. When it was over, Thexan found himself staring at a tactical display that defied everything he thought he understood about warfare. 47 Scorth lay dead or dying in the red sand. 3 pack leaders, creatures that had been the dominant species on their homeworld for over 1 million years, had been systematically outmaneuvered and eliminated by a species that had only discovered faster-than-light travel within the last century. And the humans had done it without losing a single team member. Ow! Vexera asked, echoing the question that was burning in Thexan's mind. He opened the communication channel again. Captain Rodriguez, this is Commander Thexan. That was impressive. How did you know their tactical patterns? We studied them, came the simple reply. Before we landed, we analyzed every engagement the Scorth have had with galactic forces over the past 5 years. We identified their preferences, their weaknesses, their decision-making patterns. Then, we prepared countermeasures. Thexan felt his mandibles click again, but this time it wasn't nervousness. It was recognition. You've been planning this for months. Since the day we volunteered for the mission, Captain Rodriguez confirmed. Commander, if I may ask, what's our next objective? The mining survey team needs to establish their base camp by tomorrow, and we still have approximately 400 Scorth between here and the target site. 400. Thexan looked at the tactical display, noting the massive concentrations of hostile forces scattered across the planet's surface. By any rational calculation, 12 humans against 400 Scorth should result in the complete annihilation of the human team within hours. But Thexan was beginning to understand that rational calculations might not apply to humanity. Captain, he said slowly, do you believe you can actually clear a path through 400 hostiles? There was a pause on the communication channel, and when Captain Rodriguez spoke again, Thexan could hear something in her voice that made his chitin crawl with recognition. It was the sound of absolute confidence, the kind of certainty that could only come from experience. Commander, with respect, we didn't come here to believe. We came here to succeed. 400 Scorth is a challenge, not an impossibility. My team has faced worse odds and prevailed. Worse odds. Thexan found himself wondering what kind of homeworld could produce warriors who considered a 40-to-1 disadvantage against apex predators merely challenging. What kind of evolutionary pressure could create a species that approached impossible odds with casual confidence? Understood, Captain. Proceed with your mission. We'll maintain orbital overwatch and provide tactical intelligence as needed. Appreciated, Commander. Rodriguez out. Thexan closed the communication channel and turned back to the tactical display. Across the surface of Kepler 438b, red icons representing Scorth hunting parties were converging on the 12 small blue dots that represented the human team. To any military analyst, it looked like a massacre waiting to happen. But as Thexan watched the human team begin their methodical advance toward the mining site, moving with the same casual confidence they had displayed throughout the day, he found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt in over a century of military service. He was afraid. Not afraid for the humans. Based on what he had observed so far, they were clearly capable of taking care of themselves. He was afraid of them. Afraid of what they represented. Afraid of what their presence in the galaxy might mean for the established order of things. He was afraid because he was beginning to understand that humanity might be something the galaxy had never encountered before, a species that had evolved past the normal limitations of fear, doubt, and self-preservation. A species that treated impossible odds as minor inconveniences and approached warfare with the same methodical precision that other races applied to scientific research or artistic endeavors. As he watched the tactical display update in real time, showing the human team's steady progress through increasingly hostile territory, Thexan found himself wondering if the galaxy was ready for humanity. He suspected it wasn't. 3 standard galactic months after the Kepler 438b incident, Commander Thexan found himself in a situation he never could have imagined. He was sitting in a briefing room aboard the GDC command station Nexus Prime, listening to a proposal that violated every principle of military strategy he had learned in 3 centuries of service. The target is the hegemony fortress world of Vex Thra 9. Admiral Korthak was saying, his massive draconian frame casting shadows across the holographic display. Intelligence suggests they're developing some kind of superweapon that could destabilize the entire outer rim. We need to get a reconnaissance team inside to confirm the threat and, if necessary, neutralize it. Thexan studied the tactical readout floating above the briefing table. Vex Thra 9 was a nightmare scenario from any military perspective. The planet was surrounded by 3 layers of orbital defense platforms, each capable of vaporizing a capital ship. The surface was covered with automated defense systems, sensor networks, and garrison forces numbering in the tens of thousands. The fortress itself was built into the core of a mountain, protected by energy shields that could withstand direct orbital bombardment. "With respect, Admiral," said Captain Vexera, her crystalline skin reflecting the red warning indicators that covered the tactical display. "This appears to be a suicide mission. Even if we could somehow get a team to the surface undetected, the fortress is impregnable. No infiltration team has ever successfully penetrated hegemony military installations of this classification." Admiral Korthak's massive head turned toward the far end of the briefing table, where a small group of humans sat quietly reviewing the mission parameters. "Captain Rodriguez, what's your assessment?" Thexan followed the Admiral's gaze to the human captain who had led the successful mission on Kepler 438b. She looked exactly as she had 3 months ago, calm, focused, and completely unimpressed by the magnitude of the challenge they were discussing. "It's definitely complex," Captain Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone Thexan remembered from their previous encounter. "But complexity isn't the same thing as impossibility. We'll need some additional resources and a longer preparation time than usual, but I believe this mission is achievable." The silence that followed her statement was deafening. Thexan looked around the briefing room at the faces of some of the most experienced military commanders in the galaxy, and saw the same expression of disbelief on all of them. Commander Zexthal of the Valerian Principalities was the first to speak. "Captain Rodriguez, I mean no disrespect to your capabilities, but Vex Thra 9 is considered impregnable for good reason. The hegemony has been fortifying that world for over 2 centuries. The defensive systems alone would require a full battle fleet to overcome, and even then, success would not be guaranteed. Which is exactly why a traditional approach won't work," Captain Rodriguez replied, pulling up her own tactical analysis on the holographic display. "But we're not planning a traditional approach." The display shifted to show a detailed breakdown of Vex Thra 9's defensive systems, complete with response times, coverage gaps, and patrol patterns. Thexan leaned forward, impressed despite himself. The level of detail in the human analysis was extraordinary, far beyond anything the GDC intelligence services had been able to compile. "The orbital platforms operate on a rotating schedule," Captain Rodriguez continued. "Every 73 hours, there's a 12-minute window when Platform 7 moves out of position to undergo routine maintenance. During that window, a small craft could reach the surface undetected if it approaches from the correct vector and maintains minimal energy output." 12 minutes, Admiral Korthak rumbled. "That's barely enough time to reach the surface, let alone establish any kind of operational foothold." "Which is where the mission gets interesting," Captain Rodriguez said, and Thexan noticed what might have been a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "We don't need to establish a foothold. We just need to get inside." She manipulated the display to show a cross-section of the fortress mountain. The hegemony built their installation inside the mountain for protection, but that also creates vulnerabilities. The geothermal vents that power their energy systems create a network of natural tunnels throughout the mountain. Most of these tunnels are too small for traditional infiltration, but they're perfectly adequate for our purposes. Thexan studied the tunnel network, trying to understand what the human captain was proposing. Those passages are barely 2 meters wide in most places, and they're filled with superheated steam. Any equipment you carry would be severely limited, and the environmental conditions would be lethal to most species within minutes. "Most species," Captain Rodriguez agreed. "But humans have some advantages when it comes to extreme environmental conditions. We're remarkably good at surviving in places where we probably shouldn't be able to." She pulled up another section of the display, showing what appeared to be a detailed physiological analysis. "Human thermal regulation is more efficient than most galactic species, and our equipment is designed to function in extreme conditions. More importantly, we've developed specialized training for exactly these kinds of environments." Commander Zexthal shook his head. Even if you could somehow survive the approach and infiltration, you'd still need to penetrate the fortress itself. The interior is guarded by automated defense systems, biometric scanners, and elite hegemony commandos. The probability of success approaches zero. Only if you assume we're planning to fight our way through, Captain Rodriguez said. But fighting isn't always the best solution. Sometimes, the most effective approach is to make your enemies defeat themselves. The holographic display shifted again, showing a timeline of events. The hegemony garrison follows strict operational protocols. Every detail of their daily routine is documented and predictable. Guard rotations, maintenance schedules, communication protocols, even mealtimes are standardized across their entire military structure. Fexen began to see where the human captain was leading the discussion. You're planning to use their own protocols against them. Exactly. We've identified 47 points in their operational routine where small disruptions could create cascading failures throughout their entire defensive network. A few overloaded circuits here, some misdirected communications there, and suddenly their impregnable fortress becomes a confused maze where their own systems are working against them. Admiral Korthak leaned forward, his massive claws clicking against the briefing table. This is all very theoretical, Captain, but how do you propose to actually execute these disruptions? The fortress systems are heavily shielded and protected against exactly this kind of sabotage, which is why we won't be targeting the systems directly, Captain Rodriguez replied. We'll be targeting the personnel who operate them. The display changed once more, showing detailed psychological profiles of key hegemony personnel. The hegemony military structure is based on rigid hierarchy and absolute obedience to authority. Individual initiative is discouraged, and questioning orders is considered insubordination. This creates predictable behavioral patterns that can be exploited. Fexen felt his mandibles click as he began to understand the scope of what the humans were proposing. You're planning to impersonate hegemony personnel. Better than that, Captain Rodriguez said. We're planning to become hegemony personnel, at least as far as their own systems are concerned. With the right uniforms, identification codes, and behavioral training, we can move through the fortress as if we belong there. The guards won't question us, because questioning superior officers is against their conditioning. The briefing room fell silent again as the assembled commanders processed the audacity of the human proposal. Fexen found himself trying to imagine the kind of psychological preparation required to successfully impersonate members of an alien military force while operating deep behind enemy lines. The risks are enormous, he finally said. If you're discovered, there would be no possibility of rescue or extraction. You would be completely on your own in the heart of enemy territory. Which is why we won't be discovered, Captain Rodriguez said with the same casual confidence Fexen remembered from Kepler for 38B. We spent the last 3 months studying hegemony culture, language, and military protocols. My team can pass for hegemony personnel well enough to fool their own security systems. Lieutenant Vexera spoke up from across the table. Captain, forgive my skepticism, but the hegemony are a completely different species from humans. How could you possibly impersonate them effectively enough to infiltrate a high-security military installation? Captain Rodriguez smiled, and this time there was no mistaking the expression. Would you like a demonstration? Before anyone could respond, the human captain stood and walked to the center of the briefing room. For a moment, nothing seemed to change. Then, gradually, Fexen became aware that something was different about her posture, her movement patterns, even the way she held her head. When she spoke again, her voice carried the distinctive harmonic modulations of the hegemony dialect, and her body language matched the formal military bearing that hegemony officers were famous for. Honored commanders, this operative has successfully completed infiltration preparation for the Vex-Thra 9 mission objective. The transformation was startling. Captain Rodriguez hadn't used any technological enhancement or disguise equipment, but she had somehow managed to approximate the essential characteristics of hegemony personnel so effectively that Fexen found himself momentarily confused about which species she actually belonged to. Impressive, Admiral Korthak admitted. But visual and auditory impersonation is only part of the challenge. The fortress will have biometric scanners, genetic verification systems, and other security measures that can't be fooled by acting ability alone. Captain Rodriguez returned to her normal posture and speech patterns, which is why we won't be trying to fool them. We'll be using genuine hegemony identification. The implications of that statement hit Thexan like a physical blow. You're planning to capture hegemony personnel and steal their identities. We already have, Captain Rodriguez said calmly. 3 weeks ago, a hegemony transport vessel experienced what appeared to be a mechanical failure in the neutral zone. The crew was rescued by a human merchant ship and taken to the nearest medical facility for treatment. During their recovery, we obtained everything we needed to create perfect identity duplicates. She pulled up another section of the display showing detailed medical scans and biometric data. Human surgical techniques are quite advanced, with minor cosmetic modifications and some sophisticated holographic projection equipment. My team can pass for the original personnel at any level of security screening short of a complete genetic sequence analysis. Thexan stared at the data, trying to process the implications of what he was seeing. You're proposing to undergo surgical modification to impersonate enemy personnel, infiltrate an impregnable fortress, sabotage their defensive systems from the inside, and somehow escape without being detected. That's a fair summary, Captain Rodriguez agreed. It's insane, Commander Zexthal said flatly. Even if everything goes according to plan, the margin for error is essentially zero. The slightest mistake, the smallest deviation from your plan, and your entire team dies. Captain Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. That's true. This is definitely a high-risk mission. But the alternative is allowing the hegemony to complete development of a weapon that could potentially destroy entire star systems. When we weigh the risks against the potential consequences of an action, the choice becomes clear. Admiral Korthax studied the human captain with an expression that Thexan couldn't quite identify. Captain Rodriguez, I have to ask, are you actually afraid of anything? The question hung in the air for several long seconds before Captain Rodriguez answered. Of course I am, Admiral. Fear is one of our most valuable survival tools. The difference is that we've learned not to let fear make our decisions for us. She gestured toward the tactical display. This mission terrifies me. The thought of being trapped deep inside an enemy fortress, surrounded by thousands of hostile personnel, with no backup, and no hope of rescue if something goes wrong, is absolutely horrifying. But terror is just information. It tells us that the stakes are high and that we need to be careful. It doesn't tell us that success is impossible. Thexan found himself leaning forward despite himself. How do you function effectively when you're terrified? Practice, Captain Rodriguez said simply. We train constantly in environments that simulate the worst possible conditions we might encounter. We learn to think clearly, move precisely, and execute complex plans even when every instinct is screaming at us to run away. By the time we face real danger, terror becomes just another environmental factor to account for, like gravity or atmospheric pressure. The briefing room fell silent once more as the assembled commanders contemplated the human approach to fear and danger. Thexan realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic military history, a species that had systematically learned to transform their deepest survival instincts into tactical advantages. Admiral, Captain Rodriguez continued, with your permission, I'd like to present the detailed mission timeline. If we're going to do this, we need to begin implementation within the next 48 hours. Admiral Korthak was quiet for a long moment, his massive form motionless as he considered the proposal. Finally, he spoke. Captain Rodriguez, this is the most audacious military operation I've encountered in 4 centuries of service. The probability of success is infinitesimally small, the risks are enormous, and the consequences of failure are unacceptable. He paused, and Thexan noticed what might have been approval in the Admiral's ancient eyes, which is exactly why it might actually work. You have authorization to proceed. Commander Thexan will provide whatever support you require. As the briefing broke up and the various commanders began filing out of the room, Thexan found himself approaching Captain Rodriguez. Captain, may I ask you something? Of course, Commander. When you look at a mission like this, when you see odds that would make any rational being consider surrender, what exactly do you see? Captain Rodriguez considered the question carefully. I see a problem that needs solving, Commander. Nothing more, nothing less. The complexity of the problem doesn't change the fundamental approach. Gather information, develop a plan, execute the plan, adapt as necessary. Fear and despair are luxuries we can't afford. She turned to face him directly. Commander, may I ask you something in return? Thexan nodded. When you look at humanity, what do you see? Thexan thought about everything he had observed over the past 3 months. The casual confidence, the methodical precision, the complete inability to accept impossible odds as a reason for surrender. I see something that shouldn't exist, he said finally. A species that has evolved past the normal limitations of self-preservation and rational fear response. Captain Rodriguez smiled. Thank you, Commander. That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said about us. As she walked away to begin preparations for what was certainly the most dangerous mission in GDC history, Thexan found himself wondering once again if the galaxy was ready for humanity. This time, he was certain it wasn't. 47 hours after the briefing aboard Nexus Prime, Commander Thexan found himself in a position he had never expected to occupy. He was sitting in the command center of a modified stealth corvette, watching a real-time tactical display that showed 12 human operatives preparing to attempt the impossible. The ship's silent running hung motionless in the shadow of Vexthra, Nine's largest moon, its advanced stealth systems rendering it invisible to the hegemony sensor networks that blanketed the system. Through the reinforced viewport, Thexan could see the target planet rotating slowly in the distance, its surface bristling with defensive installations and orbital platforms. T-minus 6 minutes to insertion window, reported Lieutenant Vexera from her position at the tactical station. All systems showing green. The human team reports ready for deployment. Thexan studied the mission timeline displayed on his command console. In 6 minutes, Orbital Platform 7 would begin its scheduled maintenance rotation, creating a 12-minute gap in the planetary defense grid. The human team would have exactly that long to reach the surface and disappear into the geothermal tunnel network before the gap closed again. Commander, came Captain Rodriguez's voice over the communication channel. Request permission to proceed to final insertion point. Thexan opened the channel. Permission granted, Captain. Are your people ready for this? As ready as we can be, Rodriguez replied. We've run the insertion sequence 47 times in simulation. My team knows their roles. Through the ship's internal monitoring system, Thexan could see the human team making final preparations in the deployment bay. They looked nothing like the soldiers he had observed 3 months ago. Extensive surgical modifications and holographic projection systems had transformed them into perfect replicas of hegemony personnel. Their uniforms, equipment, and even their movement patterns matched the enemy profiles exactly. The transformation was so complete that Thexan found it genuinely disturbing to look at them. It was like watching humans disappear entirely, replaced by convincing duplicates of the enemy they were about to infiltrate. T-minus 2 minutes, Lieutenant Vexera announced. Orbital Platform 7 beginning rotation sequence. On the tactical display, Thexan watched the massive defense platform slowly move out of position. The gap in the planetary coverage was tiny, a narrow corridor through which a small craft might reach the surface undetected. The margin for error was measured in seconds. Platform 7 rotation complete, Vexera reported. Insertion window is open. Window will close in 11 minutes, 43 seconds. Asterisk silent running asterisk to insertion team, Thexan transmitted. You are cleared for deployment. Good hunting. The response came back immediately. Copy that, silent running. See you on the other side. Through the tactical sensors, Thexan watched a single small craft detach from the Corvette's belly and begin its descent toward the planet. The insertion vehicle was barely larger than a shuttle, designed to carry the 12-person team and their equipment while maintaining the minimal energy signature necessary to avoid detection. For the next 11 minutes, Thexan watched the craft navigate the treacherous approach to Vexthra 9. The pilot, a human named Sergeant Shun, threaded the needle between automated defense satellites and roving patrol craft with a precision that defied belief. Every movement was calculated to the microsecond, every course correction designed to exploit blind spots in the sensor coverage. Platform 7 completing maintenance cycle, Vexera announced. Window closing in 30 seconds. On the display, the insertion craft was still 60,000 kilometers from the planetary surface. By any rational calculation, they weren't going to make it. 20 seconds to window closure. The craft suddenly changed trajectory, diving at an angle that would have been suicidal for any normal atmospheric entry. Thexan realized the human pilot was using the planet's gravity well to accelerate far beyond what the craft's engines could achieve alone. 10 seconds to window closure. The insertion craft hit the upper atmosphere, traveling at speeds that should have torn apart. For a moment, the tactical display showed nothing but interference and heat bloom as the vehicle blazed through the atmosphere like a meteor. Window closed, Vexera reported. Platform 7 has resumed position. The tactical display cleared, and Fexen found himself staring at the planetary surface. The insertion craft was gone, leaving no trace of its passage except for what appeared to be a natural meteor impact site in the mountainous terrain surrounding the Hegemony Fortress. Any contact with the insertion team? Fexen asked. Negative, Commander, Vexera replied. Radio silence was maintained throughout the insertion sequence. We won't have any communication with them until they reach the predetermined extraction point. Fexen settled back in his command chair, knowing that the next phase of the mission was completely out of his hands. Somewhere on the surface of Vex 9, 12 humans were beginning what was possibly the most audacious infiltration attempt in galactic military history. All he could do now was wait. Deep within the geothermal tunnel network beneath the Hegemony Fortress, Captain Rodriguez crouched in the superheated darkness and reviewed the mission timeline on her suit's heads-up display. The insertion had gone perfectly, with Sergeant Chen executing a controlled crash landing that left the insertion craft looking like natural meteoric debris. The team had immediately abandoned the crash site and entered the tunnel system through one of the larger geothermal vents. The environmental conditions were exactly as brutal as the mission briefings had predicted. Temperatures approaching 200 degrees Celsius, humidity levels near 100%, and an atmosphere thick with corrosive minerals and volcanic gases. For most species, the environment would have been instantly lethal. Even with their advanced protective equipment, Rodriguez and her team were operating at the absolute limits of human endurance. Status report. Rodriguez whispered into her throat microphone, using a communication frequency that wouldn't penetrate more than a few meters through the dense rock. The responses came back quickly and quietly. Alpha Team in position at Access Point 1. Bravo Team ready at Access Point 2. Charlie Team standing by at Access Point 3. Delta Team prepared for emergency extraction. Rodriguez checked her chronometer. They had been underground for 6 hours, navigating the treacherous tunnel network toward their target points within the fortress. The journey had required them to crawl through spaces barely wide enough for a human body, rappel down volcanic shafts using equipment that was constantly on the verge of failure, and traverse underground rivers of superheated water. Any normal infiltration team would have been dead 3 times over by now. All teams prepare for Phase 2 initiation, Rodriguez transmitted. Remember, we are now Hegemony personnel conducting routine maintenance operations. Stay in character, follow protocols, and trust your training. The first challenge came immediately. Access Point 1 led to a service corridor deep within the fortress basement levels. According to their intelligence, the corridor should have been empty during the shift cycle. Instead, Rodriguez's heads-up display showed 2 Hegemony guard patrolling the area. Alpha Team, hold position, she whispered. Unscheduled patrol in Corridor 7 Beta. Sergeant Martinez, the team leader for Alpha Team, came back on the channel. Captain, we can neutralize the patrol without raising alarms. Negative, Rodriguez replied immediately. Bodies create questions. We proceed according to plan. This was the moment when the mission would either succeed or fail catastrophically. Instead of trying to fight their way through the fortress defenses, the humans were going to walk through them. Rodriguez activated her holographic disguise system and stepped out of the access tunnel into the service corridor. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. To any observer, she appeared to be Subcommander Vectar, a mid-level Hegemony engineering officer conducting routine inspections. The 2 guards noticed her immediately, snapping to attention with the rigid precision that Hegemony military discipline demanded. Subcommander, one of them said in the formal Hegemony dialect, we were not informed of scheduled maintenance operations in this sector. Rodriguez allowed a hint of irritation to enter her voice, exactly as a Hegemony officer would when dealing with incompetent subordinates. The maintenance schedules are updated on a need-to-know basis, Trooper. Your duty is to maintain security, not to question the operational requirements of your superiors. The guard posture became even more rigid. Of course, Subcommander. Apologies for the inquiry. Focus on your assigned duties, Rodriguez continued. her voice carrying the exact tone of authority that hegemony personnel were conditioned to obey without question. I will be conducting inspections throughout this sector for the next several hours. Ensure that patrol schedules do not interfere with critical maintenance operations. Understood, Subcommander. We will adjust our route accordingly. The guards marched away with perfect military precision, leaving Rodriguez alone in the corridor. She waited until they were completely out of sight before signaling the rest of Alpha Team to proceed. Phase 2 initiated, she transmitted to all teams. Alpha Team proceeding to primary objectives. Over the next 4 hours, Rodriguez watched her teams systematically infiltrate every critical system within the fortress. They moved through the installation like ghosts, their disguises and behavioral training allowing them to pass unnoticed among the hegemony personnel. Sergeant Kim's team accessed the primary communication relay and installed monitoring software that would allow them to intercept and redirect hegemony transmissions. Corporal Johnson's team reached the main power distribution center and placed carefully designed power fluctuation devices that could create cascading failures throughout the fortress electrical grid. Staff Sergeant Williams' team penetrated the command center's auxiliary systems and installed logic bombs in the tactical computers. Every operation was executed with the same methodical precision Rodriguez had come to expect from her people. They worked within the established hegemony protocols, using the enemy's own security procedures to gain access to their most sensitive systems. The most challenging phase came when Rodriguez herself had to access the primary research laboratory where the suspected superweapon was being developed. The laboratory was located in the most secure section of the fortress, protected by multiple layers of security and constantly monitored by elite hegemony commandos. Rodriguez approached the laboratory checkpoint disguised as Commander Thekvar, a senior research administrator. Her credentials were perfect. Her biometric data matched the stolen identity exactly, and her behavioral patterns had been rehearsed until they were indistinguishable from the original. Commander Thekvar, the security checkpoint officer said, reviewing her identification. "You are early for your scheduled inspection." "The research schedule has been accelerated," Rodriguez replied, allowing a note of stress to enter her voice. "The High Command is demanding status updates ahead of the original timeline." The checkpoint officer's expression became appropriately concerned. In hegemony culture, disappointing the High Command was considered worse than death. "Of course, Commander. All access protocols have been cleared. Research Team 7 is expecting you in Laboratory Complex Omega." Rodriguez proceeded through the checkpoint and into the heart of the hegemony research facility. What she found there was worse than anything the GDC intelligence estimates had suggested. The superweapon wasn't just a theoretical project. It was nearly complete. The device filled most of the laboratory complex, a massive construction of crystalline energy conduits and quantum processing cores. According to the technical specifications displayed on the laboratory monitors, the weapon was designed to destabilize stellar cores, causing target stars to collapse into artificial supernovas that would sterilize entire solar systems. Rodriguez activated her recording systems and began documenting everything she could see: the weapon's design, its operational parameters, the projected deployment timeline. All of it was far beyond what the GDC had believed possible. "Alpha Team to all units," she transmitted on the secure channel. "Primary objective confirmed. Threat level exceeds all projections. Recommend immediate extraction and orbital bombardment of target site." The response came from Sergeant Martinez. "Captain, we can't extract yet. The weapon is too well protected for conventional bombardment. Even a direct hit from a capital ship wouldn't be sufficient to guarantee destruction." Rodriguez studied the technical readouts, recognizing the problem immediately. The weapon was protected by the same energy shields that defended the fortress itself. Orbital bombardment would be ineffective unless the shields could be disabled from the inside. "All teams prepare for Phase 3 operations," she transmitted. "We're going to bring this facility down from the inside." What followed was the most complex sabotage operation in human military history. Working with surgical precision, the human teams began systematically overloading every critical system within the fortress. Power conduits were rerouted to create feedback loops that would cascade through the entire electrical grid. Communication relays were programmed to broadcast contradictory orders that would confuse and disorient the garrison forces. Environmental controls were modified to create artificial emergencies that would trigger automated evacuation protocols. The beauty of the plan was that none of the sabotage would be immediately apparent. The systems would continue to function normally until a specific sequence of events triggered the cascade failures. When that happened, the fortress's own defensive systems would turn against it, creating chaos and destruction far beyond what any external attack could achieve. Rodriguez was preparing to trigger the final sequence when the alarms began to sound. Security alert. Unauthorized personnel detected in Sector 7. All units respond immediately. She froze, her mind racing through the possible causes of the security breach. Had one of her teams been detected? Had their disguises failed? Had someone noticed an inconsistency in their cover stories? Alpha Team, report status, she transmitted urgently. Alpha Team secure, came Sergeant Martinez's immediate reply. No contact with hostile forces. Bravo Team secure. Charlie Team secure. Delta Team secure. Rodriguez frowned, trying to understand what had triggered the alert. If none of her teams had been compromised, then what had the fortress security detected? The answer came 30 seconds later when a laboratory's main entrance burst open and a squad of hegemony elite commandos stormed into the research complex. They moved with deadly efficiency, weapons raised, and scanning for threats. Rodriguez realized immediately that her cover was blown. Somehow, someone had identified her as an imposter. She had perhaps seconds before the commandos discovered her true identity. Instead of panicking, she did something that would have been impossible for any other species. She smiled. All teams, she transmitted calmly, initiate final sequence. Time to bring down the house. Across the fortress, carefully placed explosive charges detonated simultaneously, severing critical power conduits and creating the cascade failures that would destroy the installation from within. Emergency alarms began blaring as systems throughout the complex began shutting down or exploding in spectacular fashion. In the chaos that followed, 12 humans fought their way through a collapsing enemy fortress, carrying with them the intelligence that would save the galaxy from a weapon capable of destroying entire star systems. And in the command center of the Silent Running, Commander Thexan watched the fortress of Vexthra 9 tear itself apart and realized that he was witnessing the birth of a legend that would terrify the galaxy's enemies for generations to come. The evacuation of Vexthra 9 was something that would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. Not because it was a masterpiece of tactical planning or logistical coordination, but because it was the first time anyone had ever witnessed 12 humans transform a hopeless situation into a victory that defied every known law of military science. Commander Thexan watched the chaos unfold from the bridge of the Silent Running, the tactical displays showing him a real-time view of the fortress's destruction. The cascade failures triggered by Captain Rodriguez's team were spreading through the installation like wildfire, causing systems to overload and explode in a chain reaction that was tearing the mountain apart from the inside. Commander, Lieutenant Vexera reported, her voice tight with amazement. The fortress primary reactor is approaching critical overload. The entire installation will be destroyed within the next 17 minutes. Any contact with the extraction team? Thexan asked. Negative, sir. All communications with the fortress have been severed by the system failures. We have no way of knowing the status of Captain Rodriguez or her people. Thexan studied the tactical readout, trying to understand how 12 humans could possibly escape from a fortress that was literally exploding around them. The extraction plan had called for the team to reach a predetermined rendezvous point where they could be recovered by shuttle, but that plan had assumed they would have time to move through the facility systematically. Instead, they were trapped inside a mountain that was about to become a nuclear crater. Sir, Vexera continued, recommend we withdraw to minimum safe distance. If the reactor goes critical, the explosion will be visible from orbit. Negative, Thexan replied immediately. We maintain position until we confirm the fate of the extraction team. What he didn't say was that he was beginning to understand something about humanity that most galactic species would never comprehend. Humans didn't abandon their people. Not ever. Not under any circumstances. The concept of acceptable losses was foreign to them in a way that went beyond military doctrine into something that resembled religious conviction. If Captain Rodriguez and her team were going to die on Vexta 9, they would die trying to complete their mission and protect each other. And if there was any possibility of saving them, no matter how remote, Thexan was going to take it. All stations, "Prepare for emergency extraction operations," he announced to the bridge crew. "I want every sensor array focused on the extraction coordinates. The moment we detect any human life signs, we go in after them." Deep within the collapsing fortress, Captain Rodriguez was learning exactly how much punishment the human body could endure when survival was the only alternative to failure. The laboratory complex where she had discovered the superweapon was now a maze of collapsed corridors and rooms filled with toxic smoke and superheated debris. The explosion that had initiated the cascade failure had thrown her across the laboratory, slamming her into a wall hard enough to crack 3 ribs and give her a concussion that made thinking clearly a constant struggle. Her disguise system had been damaged in the blast, leaving her looking human again for the first time in days. "Alpha Team, report status," she transmitted through her throat microphone, hoping the communication system was still functional. "Alpha Team here," came Sergeant Martinez's voice, distorted by static and interference. "We're trapped in the auxiliary power station. The main corridor has collapsed, and we're dealing with coolant leaks and radiation exposure. Still mobile, but we're going to need an alternate extraction route." "Bravo Team reporting," said Corporal Johnson. "We're in the command center ruins. 3 wounded, but ambulatory. The entire upper level has collapsed, and we're seeing signs of structural instability throughout this section. Recommend immediate evacuation." "Charlie Team here," Staff Sergeant Williams added. "We're pinned down in the armory. Automated defense systems are still active and engaging anything that moves. We've neutralized most of them, but we're running low on ammunition and explosives." Rodriguez checked her suit's chronometer. They had 14 minutes before the reactor reached critical overload. According to her tactical mapping system, they were scattered across 3 different sections of the fortress, separated by collapsed corridors and areas that were now inaccessible due to radiation or structural damage. Any reasonable military commander would have recognized that the situation was hopeless. The extraction plan was destroyed, the facility was collapsing around them, and they had no way to reach the original rendezvous point before the reactor exploded. Rodriguez wasn't interested in reasonable assessments. "All teams, new plan," she transmitted calmly. "We're going to carve our own extraction route directly through the mountain. Charlie Team, I need you to place your remaining explosives to create a new passage between your position and the geothermal vent network. Bravo Team, you're going to punch a hole through the collapsed corridor using whatever heavy equipment you can salvage for the command center. Alpha Team, work your way back toward the original infiltration route and prepare charges to widen the passages for emergency extraction." "Captain," Sergeant Martinez replied, "with respect, that's going to require more explosive force than we have available. Even if we could clear the passages, the detonations might trigger additional structural collapse that would trap us permanently. Which is why we're not going to clear the passages," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone Thexan had learned to associate with impossible human plans. "We're going to ride the collapse." The silence on the communication channel lasted for several seconds before Williams spoke up. "Captain, could you clarify what you mean by ride the collapse?" Rodriguez pulled up the fortress structural analysis on her suit's display system. The mountain's internal structure was now critically unstable, with multiple points of failure that would cause progressive collapse as the reactor approached overload. Instead of trying to escape before the collapse occurred, she was proposing to use the collapse itself as their extraction method. "The geothermal vents extend all the way to the surface," she explained. "When the reactor goes critical, the explosion is going to create a pressure wave that travels through the mountain's internal structure. If we position ourselves in the right location within the vent network, that pressure wave will essentially launch us to the surface like a projectile." "Captain," Johnson said slowly, "that's completely insane. The forces involved would be enormous. We'd be fired out of the mountain at velocities that would turn us into paste on impact." "Only if we don't control our trajectory," Rodriguez replied. "But we have emergency parachutes and maneuvering thrusters. With the right timing and positioning, we can use the explosion to reach the surface and then control our descent to the extraction coordinates." She manipulated the display to show her calculations. "The reactor will reach critical overload in approximately 12 minutes. If we can reach the primary geothermal vent in 8 minutes, we'll have enough time to position ourselves for optimal launch trajectory when the explosion occurs." The plan was so audacious that it transcended insanity and entered the realm of inspired madness. They would essentially be using a nuclear explosion to catapult themselves out of a collapsing mountain, then parachuting to safety while the entire fortress was vaporized below them. All teams, Rodriguez continued, I need confirmation that you're prepared to execute this extraction plan. Anyone who isn't comfortable with the risk profile can attempt to reach the original extraction point instead. The responses came back immediately and without hesitation. Alpha Team, ready to proceed. Bravo Team, standing by. Charlie Team prepared for insane human extraction protocol. Rodriguez smiled despite the desperate circumstances. She had served with these people for over 2 years, and their absolute trust in her planning capabilities never failed to both humble and terrify her. Understood. All teams converge on the primary geothermal vent. Move fast, stay low, and remember that we're now racing a nuclear explosion. What followed was a running battle through a facility that was actively destroying itself around them. The humans moved through corridors filled with toxic smoke, climbed over collapsed debris that was still shifting and falling, and fought past automated defense systems that were malfunctioning in increasingly dangerous ways. Every step of the journey required split-second decisions and perfect coordination. When Sergeant Martinez's team found their route blocked by a wall of superheated metal, they used their remaining explosive charges to blast through it, accepting the risk of further structural collapse. When Corporal Johnson's team encountered a section where the floor had given way completely, they improvised a zip-line system using equipment cables and gravity to swing across the gap. The most challenging obstacle came when Staff Sergeant Williams's team reached a corridor that was flooding with radioactive coolant from the damaged reactor systems. The passage was their only route to the rendezvous point, but traversing it would expose them to lethal levels of radiation. Williams didn't hesitate. Charlie Team, going through the hot zone. We'll sprint the passage and hope our radiation shielding holds long enough to reach the other side. Negative, Rodriguez transmitted immediately. Charlie Team, hold position. I'm coming to you. Captain, there's no time. The reactor is approaching critical, and we can't wait for you to backtrack through the facility. Who said anything about backtracking? Rodriguez replied. She studied the facility schematics on her display, identifying a route that would take her directly through the heart of the collapsing fortress. It was a path that would require her to rappel down a damaged elevator shaft, crawl through a ventilation system that was filled with superheated steam, and then blast through a reinforced bulkhead using improvised explosives. Under normal circumstances, the route would be suicide. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Rodriguez was beginning to understand that normal limitations might not apply to this situation. 18 minutes later, she emerged from a ventilation grate directly above Williams's position, covered in soot and moving with the mechanical precision of someone operating on pure adrenaline and determination. Captain, Williams called out as she dropped down beside his team. How did you get here so fast? Shortcuts, Rodriguez replied briefly. Status report? We've got the radioactive corridor ahead, approximately 40 meters of exposure zone. Radiation levels are climbing steadily. Our suits should protect us for maybe 90 seconds of direct exposure. Rodriguez studied the corridor, noting the flowing coolant and the readings on a radiation detector. 90 seconds should be enough time to traverse 40 meters, but only if nothing went wrong. All teams, final convergence in 3 minutes, she transmitted. Charlie Team and are about to transit the radiation zone. Everyone else proceed directly to the geothermal vent and prepare for immediate extraction. She turned to Williams. Sergeant, we're going to run this corridor like it's a sprint race. No stopping, no hesitation, no looking back. If someone falls, the others keep going. Understood. Williams nodded grimly. Understood, Captain. Charlie Team, prepare to move on my mark. Rodriguez checked her chronometer one final time. They had less than 4 minutes before reactor overload. If they were going to make this work, everything had to happen perfectly. Mark. The 5-person team sprinted into the radioactive corridor like runners breaking from a starting line. The radiation alarms on their suits began screaming immediately, warning them of exposure levels that would be lethal within minutes. But they had trained for this, prepared for this, accepted the risks involved. They covered the 40-meter distance in 63 seconds, emerging from the far end of the corridor with radiation dosimeters showing exposure levels that would have hospitalized most species for weeks. 2 minutes later, All four teams had converged at the primary geothermal vent. The opening was a natural chimney that extended from the mountain's core to the surface, heated by volcanic activity, and currently filled with superheated steam that reduced visibility to less than a meter. Reactor critical overload in 90 seconds, Rodriguez announced. Everyone into the vent. Spread out vertically to avoid collision during launch. Activate your emergency beacons so extraction can locate us during descent. One by one, the 12 human operatives lowered themselves into the geothermal vent and positioned themselves for what was certainly the most unconventional extraction procedure in military history. They hung suspended in the superheated darkness, waiting for a nuclear explosion to launch them toward the surface like human cannonballs. 30 seconds to overload, Rodriguez announced. In the silence that followed, she found herself thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The months of planning, the surgical modifications, the weeks spent learning to impersonate an alien species, the systematic infiltration and sabotage of an impregnable fortress. And now they were about to trust their lives to a plan that depended on precise calculations, perfect timing, and the hope that human engineering was robust enough to survive forces that should have been instantly lethal. 10 seconds, she announced. Captain, came Sergeant Martinez's voice over the communication channel. It's been an honor serving with you. The honor has been mine, Rodriguez replied. See you topside. The explosion that followed was visible from 3 star systems away. The explosion of Vex Thra 9's reactor core created a new star in the local sky for exactly 17 seconds before collapsing into a fireball that vaporized everything within a 50-kilometer radius. The shockwave was detectable by seismic sensors on planets 3 systems away, and the electromagnetic pulse temporarily disabled communications across half the sector. Commander Thexan watched it happen from the bridge of the silent running, his mandibles clicking in what his species considered a prayer for the dead. The tactical displays showed nothing but expanding clouds of superheated plasma where the hegemony fortress had been. No life signs, no emergency beacons, no indication that anything could have survived the destruction. Commander, Lieutenant Vexeris said quietly, recommend we withdraw to report mission completion. There's no possibility of survivors. Thexan continued staring at the displays, searching for something that would prove his growing understanding of humanity was correct. The humans had done the impossible so many times that he had begun to believe they were capable of transcending physical limitations entirely. But even humans couldn't survive a nuclear explosion at Ground Zero. Sir, Vexera pressed gently. We should begin our return to base. Negative, Thexan replied firmly. Full sensor sweep of the explosion zone. Maximum resolution, all frequencies. If there's anything out there, I want to find it. The sensor sweep began immediately. Sophisticated detection equipment probing the aftermath of the explosion for any sign of artificial objects or biological life. For the first 20 minutes, the results were exactly what Thexan had expected. Nothing but residual radiation and expanding debris clouds. Then, at the very edge of the sensor range, something appeared on the tactical display. Contact bearing 27 Mark IV, reported sensor technician Kexdow. Multiple small objects, artificial construction, approaching our position at high velocity. Thexan leaned forward, studying the sensor reading. 12 objects, each roughly human-sized, falling through space with ballistic trajectories that suggested they had been launched from the planet's surface at enormous velocity. Emergency beacons, he breathed. They actually did it. The rescue operation that followed was like nothing the GDC had ever attempted. The 12 objects turned out to be humans in atmospheric entry suits, their bodies protected by emergency life support systems, and their descent controlled by sophisticated maneuvering thrusters. They were unconscious, suffering from massive acceleration trauma and radiation exposure, but they were alive. More importantly, they had succeeded. Captain Rodriguez was the last to be brought aboard the silent running. Her emergency beacon finally activated when she regained consciousness during the final approach to the ship. She was carried to the medical bay on a stretcher, her body showing the effects of forces that should have been instantly lethal. Captain, Thexan said as the medical team worked to stabilize her condition, the mission. Rodriguez managed to focus her eyes on his face despite what the medical scanners were showing as a severe concussion. Complete, she whispered. Weapon destroyed. Intelligence recovered. Fortress neutralized. She reached into a sealed compartment on her suit and extracted a data storage device. Everything's here. Technical specifications, deployment timeline, research personnel profiles. The hegemony superweapon program is finished. Thexan accepted the device with something approaching reverence. The information contained within it would save countless lives across the galaxy. The intelligence would allow the GDC to identify and neutralize similar weapons programs before they could threaten galactic security. "Captain," he said quietly, "how did you know the explosion would launch you to orbital altitude instead of simply vaporizing you?" Rodriguez managed what might have been a smile. "We didn't, but the alternative was certain death, so we calculated the probabilities and took the chance that offered the best odds of survival. The odds of surviving a nuclear explosion at ground zero approach zero for any known species." "Approaching zero isn't the same as being zero," Rodriguez replied. "And humans have a long history of surviving things that should have killed us." Over the next several days, as the silent running made its way back to GDC headquarters, Thexan found himself spending long hours in a medical bay, watching the human recovery process and trying to understand what he had witnessed. The medical data was extraordinary. All 12 humans had suffered massive physical trauma that would have killed most galactic species instantly. Radiation exposure, acceleration injuries, thermal damage from the explosion, impact trauma from their high-velocity extraction from the planet. Yet they were not only alive, they were recovering at rates that defied medical understanding. More significantly, they were already planning their next mission. The hegemony has 3 other research facilities where they might be developing similar weapons, Rodriguez explained to Thexan from her medical bed. Her body still connected to life support systems, but her mind already focused on the next challenge. "We should investigate those sites before they have time to relocate their programs." "Captain," Thexan said carefully, "you nearly died. Your entire team nearly died. Perhaps it would be appropriate to allow other units to handle the follow-up investigations." Rodriguez turned to look at him directly, and Thexan saw something in her eyes that made his chitin crawl with recognition. It was the same expression he had seen before the Kepler 438b mission and, again, before the Vexthra 9 infiltration. It was the look of someone who had already decided that impossible odds were simply another tactical factor to be considered and overcome. "Commander," she said quietly, "with respect, those other units haven't spent months learning hegemony protocols and infiltration techniques. They haven't developed the specialized equipment and procedures necessary for this type of operation. Most importantly, they haven't proven they can succeed against impossible odds." She gestured weakly toward the rest of her team, who were recovering in nearby medical beds. "We're the only unit in the galaxy that has successfully infiltrated a hegemony fortress and lived to tell about it. That experience makes us uniquely qualified to handle the follow-up missions." Thexan studied the 12 humans lying in the medical bay, each one recovering from injuries that should have been fatal. They looked fragile and broken, connected to machines that were keeping their damaged bodies alive. Yet he could see in their eyes the same terrifying determination that had carried them through every impossible situation they had encountered. "Captain," he said finally, "may I ask you something about human psychology?" "Of course. When you look at a mission that has a 99% probability of failure and almost certain death, what exactly motivates you to attempt it anyway?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "Commander, I think you're approaching this from the wrong perspective. You're asking what motivates us to attempt impossible missions. But that's not how we see it." She turned to face him more directly. "We don't see impossible missions. We see problems that haven't been solved yet. The probability of failure doesn't change the fundamental question: is the objective worth pursuing? If the answer is yes, then we develop a plan to achieve success. The difficulty of the plan doesn't change our commitment to executing it. But surely you must feel fear when facing such overwhelming odds." "Of course we do," Rodriguez replied immediately. "Fear is one of our most valuable survival tools. It keeps us alert, focused, and motivated to avoid making careless mistakes. But fear is just information about the environment we're operating in. It doesn't make decisions for us." Thexan found himself thinking about his own species' relationship with fear and danger. Throughout galactic civilization, fear was considered a rational response to impossible odds. When faced with certain death, the logical choice was to withdraw, regroup, and seek alternative solutions. But humans seem to have evolved past that limitation. They experience fear just as intensely as any other species, but they had learned to treat it as a source of tactical information rather than a decision-making override. Commander, Rodriguez continued, may I ask you something about galactic military doctrine? Certainly. When you encounter a problem that seems impossible to solve with conventional methods, what do? Thexan, consider the question. We analyze the situation, calculate the probability of success, and, if the odds are unfavorable, we seek alternative approaches or withdraw to reassess. And if there are no alternative approaches? If withdrawal means accepting unacceptable consequences. The question hung in the air between them, and Thexan realized he was being forced to confront a fundamental difference between human and galactic military philosophy. Most species, when faced with truly impossible odds, would eventually accept failure as inevitable. They would cut their losses, minimize casualties, and seek diplomatic or technological solutions to problems that couldn't be solved through direct action. Humans, apparently, had never learned to accept inevitable failure. Captain, he said slowly, are you suggesting that the fundamental difference between human and galactic military capabilities is that we have learned to recognize impossible situations while you have not? Rodriguez smiled, and this time there was no mistaking the expression. Commander, we recognize impossible situations perfectly well. We just don't let them stop us. Over the next several weeks, as the silent running completed its journey back to GDC headquarters, Thexan found himself filing the most extraordinary mission report in galactic military history. The successful infiltration and destruction of Vex Thra 9 had eliminated a weapon capable of destroying entire star systems. The intelligence recovered during the mission had exposed a network of similar research facilities across hegemony space. Most importantly, the operation had demonstrated that humanity possessed capabilities that could fundamentally change the balance of power in galactic conflicts. But, as Thexan wrote his report, he found himself struggling to convey the most significant aspect of what he had witnessed. The technical details of the mission were impressive, but comprehensible. The strategic implications were enormous, but calculable. What defied description was the psychological impact of watching 12 humans transform impossible odds into routine operational parameters. He had spent 3 centuries believing that he understood courage, determination, and military effectiveness. He had commanded forces in dozens of campaigns, led troops through situations that tested every aspect of their training and morale. He thought he had seen every variation of courage that sapient life was capable of displaying. Standing with human warriors had taught him that he had never truly understood courage at all. Real courage wasn't the absence of fear or the suppression of survival instincts. Real courage was the ability to experience terror so profound it should have been paralyzing, then proceed with mission execution as if fear was simply another environmental factor to be accounted for and overcome. Real courage was looking at odds that guaranteed death and asking not whether success was possible, but what would be required to achieve it anyway. Real courage was refusing to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable, no matter how many rational beings insisted otherwise. As the silent running docked at GDC headquarters and began offloading its precious cargo of human warriors and recovered intelligence, Thexan found himself wondering once again whether the galaxy was ready for humanity. This time, he was certain it wasn't. But as he watched Captain Rodriguez and her team walking off the ship under their own power, already discussing plans for their next impossible mission, Thexan realized that the galaxy's readiness was no longer relevant. Humanity was here. They were operational. And they had just demonstrated that the word impossible might need to be permanently removed from galactic military vocabulary. The age of human warriors had begun, and Thexan suspected that the universe would never be quite the same. Standing in the docking bay, watching 12 humans who had literally been launched out of a nuclear explosion walk casually toward their next briefing, Commander Thexan learned fear for the first time. Not fear of death, or pain, or failure. Fear of what sapient beings could become when they refused to surrender. Fear of hope itself, weaponized, and made manifest in beings who trade.